Services at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also chair of the ACUDA Online Learning Subcommittee. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which will provide an overview of national policy perspectives on cybersecurity for higher education. Our presenters today are Ken Salomon, Chairman of the Lobbying and Policy Group of Thomson Coburn LLP, Eric Berger, Co-Director of the Security and Software Engineering Research Center at Georgetown University, and Rodney Petersen, Privacy and Security Consultant Executive. Ken, I'd now like to turn things over to you. Please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Let me just start by setting the environment. We read about cybersecurity attacks now, it seems to me, virtually every day. It's become a ubiquitous problem. Everyone is being hit. No sector is immune, whether it's government, retail, financial services, high-tech, consumers, health, research. Everybody is now a target. And there's even a concern about the cybersecurity of medical devices, which is really sort of a frightening thought. And higher education institutions are just a microcosm of the economy as a whole when it comes to this. It's a very target-rich environment. You have student data, faculty data, staff financial information, social security numbers of students and faculty and staff, medical data, research information, very inviting computer systems to go after. The list goes on. Some sectors are quite ahead of others in reacting to the threats that have grown. Whether it's Target or Home Depot or J.P. Morgan, the University of Maryland, I think it was University College had a major breach, most recently this week, Staples. The financial services sector is quite ways down the road. Just earlier this week, the Financial Services Roundtable held a cybersecurity forum or summit at which the FBI and the Secret Service looked inside recent hacking attacks, why it's happening, how it's happening, and what the risks are. The purpose of today's webinar is to look at how Washington is responding or not responding and what higher education institutions need to know and do in this environment. So turning to Washington, as on cybersecurity, as is typical on virtually any other policy issue in D.C., there's gridlock between the Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate and between Congress and the administration. It's just cybersecurity is typical of so many other issues where Congress and the President, Republicans and Democrats, may be united on the need to do something, but not on the approach and how to get there. There's a bipartisan bill in the House of Representatives, but the Senate is at an impasse. The differences come down to approach. The Democrats want a more regulatory approach to cybersecurity and how to deal with the risks and information sharing. The Republicans favor a voluntary non-regulatory approach, so we're in gridlock. The next slide just identifies who the major players are in the House of Representatives and their committees of jurisdiction, why they're key players. I'm not going to describe who's done what. The slide after that is their Senate counterparts. One thing that's interesting is the three people who are major players in the Senate on security with the asterisk in front of their name, they're retiring at the end of this Congress. So new people will step up, and that would likely slow any Senate progress in the new Congress, which convenes January 3rd. So looking at the House of Representatives, it's passed 5 cybersecurity bills in the current Congress. None have been taken up by the Senate. There are two major bills, and the first one is the Cyber Information Sharing and Protection Act. I'm not going to go through the details, but because, frankly, the next few slides are sort of futile because of the gridlock in Washington. The second House bill is the National Cybersecurity and Critical Information Protection Act. Again, this just sort of outlines what are the key elements of the bill, but it's, as I said, sort of dead in the Senate. On the Senate side, the major bill is the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, or CISA, I guess you'd pronounce it, C-I-S-A. It's moved through the process in the Senate on a bipartisan vote in the Intelligence Committee. It's on the legislative calendar, but no action has been taken since July 10th. The concern is that the federal government would collect data on Americans' private information in the name of security, and that government spying on civilians has become an ever-increasing concern. So we have an election, a midterm election on November 4th. After that, Congress will come back for anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks, depending on the outcome of the election and who is going to control the Senate. So that 2 to 5 week session is called a lame duck. There are a few things that have to pass during that, continued funding of the government being one of them. But I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for Congress or hoping that Congress is going to pass something on cybersecurity during that period. It's just not going to happen. There's not enough consensus, and there's not enough time to reach consensus in the Senate, let alone between the House and the Senate. So in the face of gridlock, early last year, the White House stepped into the fight to try and move things along. I think it was really intended as a placeholder, but it's become more than that. In February of last year, the President issued an executive order improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, tasking the National Institute for Standards and Technology to develop voluntary guidelines or incentives for the private sector to share cybersecurity risk information with the federal government. The President sent a one-year deadline to finalize the guidelines. It went through a public notice and comment process, if you will, with, I think, 2 different iterations of the guidelines, or framework as they call it, sent out for public comment. And in February of this year, NIST released a cybersecurity framework, which is a voluntary how-to guide for critical infrastructure owners and operators. And it's important to note that the framework is designed for the critical infrastructure protection. And higher ed is not considered critical infrastructure. Nevertheless, I think the framework is important as sort of setting a standard of conduct that insurers and other folks, including policymakers, will look at for all sectors, various sectors of the economy to adhere to as a standard. Just this month, the White House urged Congress to pass smaller cybersecurity bills rather than one big omnibus bill. And again, I just don't think that there's time for this to happen in the lame duck session of Congress. You're looking at best at next year. Meanwhile, cyber attacks continue. They're accelerating. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Berger to talk to you about what's happening on that front.
All right, thank you very much, Ken. So one question you might have is, what does this have to do with the higher education community? As Ken mentioned, the Executive Order 13636, is targeted towards critical infrastructure. And when you think about critical infrastructure, you think about things like nuclear power plants or the water supply or aviation, public health services. But if you think about it, even though we're not critical infrastructure, we do have similar issues. And in particular, we have liabilities for breach. Another issue is even though we may not be a target of an attack, we can be a beachhead for an attack. So this is where an attacker will, climb into like a university's network and use that as a launching point for getting into our critical infrastructure or for extracting other information. Of course, there's the other issues which I'm going to get to soon about what our exposures. But one thing that's kind of really important from the tradition of higher education is that we have a tradition of openness and a tradition of trust. You contrast that with a lot of talk here on the Hill of, oh my goodness, we have these open networks, we need to clamp down, we need to secure these networks. So how can we keep the universities and higher education's view of keeping these open networks in trust when there are legislators and regulators who want to clamp down? And really, one thing it does come down to is, especially in an election year, politicians sometimes feel like they have to do something, and sometimes they feel they need to do that even if it would cause more harm. So let's look at what kind of exposures you'd have in the higher educational environment. Well, Ken did mention a few. Universities do collect personally identifiable information, whether it's in your application process or for matriculated students, or let's not forget, the education enterprise is just that. It's an enterprise. You have employee records, you have vendor partner records, so you're collecting maybe health information because you're either self-insuring, maybe you happen to be an institution that's also running a hospital, so HIPAA and the Health Act, the HITECH Act are issues for you. Quite often, your registrar's office and bursar's office are collecting credit card numbers, so you have financial exposures. And if you look at any of those issues alone, you're a juicy target. Then you add in some other sort of spice in the higher education environment, like lots of uncontrolled computing resources, and let's face it, you have a lot of smart people, many of whom, if you're looking at student bodies, have idle hands, and a culture of live and let live, and you basically can become a source of attacks, whether it's a witting source of attacks, namely your students are sort of going beyond the norms of behavior, but also being an unwitting participant, that your infrastructure is used as a launching point for other attacks. Ken mentioned the NIST Framework, and what we did when we put together, and I say we because NIST did a very good job of involving the private sector, and there was a very long, drawn out through that year to produce the report. There's a lot of feedback from industry. There were 3 or 4 meetings, face-to-face meetings held around the country, open to basically anybody with an email address to come in and sort of discuss best practices from across the critical infrastructure space. But if you look at the critical infrastructure space, I mean, yes, some sectors are very cyber aware, such as large telecommunications companies, large financial services companies, but you also have some sectors that are underinvested, like the energy and power industry. As well, there was a lot of input from industry and academia, like IEEE USA, the CERC itself, a lot of individual comments. And basically, the goal for this framework was to come up with sort of an education for industries in general as to what best practices are. Given that it has this educational focus, it's not prescriptive. There are very few things where the framework says do this or don't do that. It's more about you should be aware of cyber issues. You should be aware that you might need some policies, and then it has pointers to existing standards and existing practices. To give you an idea, the framework itself is about 16 pages of text, so I would actually encourage you to read it. It won't take you that long. It has about 18 pages of matrices, and in those matrices, about 60% of it are references to existing standards and practices, whether it's COBIT from ISAC, that's the control objectives for information and related technology, so that's looking at how do you control IT from sort of a governance and risk management perspective, or the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. Again, this is well-known existing standards for how to protect financial information. So if we revisit again the focus of the NIST framework, again you'd think, oh, they're talking about nuclear power plants, and clearly we're not a nuclear power plant. But if you look, the headline here, the REN-ISAC, the Research and Education Networking Information Sharing and Analysis Center. ISACs were created by a presidential policy directive. It was PPD 63, and yeah, it was about critical infrastructure, but it also said, there may be other sectors that would need this same kind of framework and same kind of environment. So while education is not a nuclear power plant, it is part of the internet ecosystem, meaning just as being good corporate citizens, we need to be mindful, how should we say, not to pollute the environment. So the REN-ISAC is part of the Homeland Security's voluntary Information Sharing and Analysis Center. The focus of REN-ISAC is on cyber threat intelligence sharing, and there's no risk analysis, so it's not saying this is important, it's something you've got to deal with, or this is something unimportant. That all depends on your own organization's posture, the kind of data you have, and all that. But there's also no judgment, so they're not going to say, oh boy, you're stupid for not having put in a control, or you're stupid for being breached. It really is a safe environment for this information sharing. There we go. So this is what the alerts kind of look like. This is taken from today's REN-ISAC homepage. The first one up there is the most recent one. You may have heard of the shell shock breach. So REN-ISAC, shares that out there. It'll push you an email, call you up saying, hey, there's something you need to deal with. And then it's got, the web version of the alert. You can go look it up, or a printer-friendly copy. You may have also heard of the Heartbleed alert, which was a vulnerability in SSL. And again, this kind of describes what it is. If we look at this next one, this is part of the importance of being cyber aware. Prevent your institution from being an unwitting partner in these attacks. Right now, today, the case law isn't out there, but you can imagine it will be there, that if you could have known about an attack being launched from your enterprise and you don't do anything about it, you may in the future have some liability. Now, if we look at sort of the next piece, notice how we've got two different versions. We've got the tech version of the alert, which goes into all the details about the in fact the previous one is about the network time protocol. But not just explaining the low-level bits and bytes, but letting your CIO, letting the C-suite understand why it's important for you to mediate this. Again, looking at, what are your potential liabilities and exposures from this particular alert. So cybersecurity, even though it's a lot more than technology, technology is obviously an important factor. So having, I should say, good hygiene, so an inventory of what's in your network, where we said, hey, there's a shell shock alert that REN-ISAC put out. What machines do I need to update? What's out there that could put me at risk? Audits are going to be critical, and that's something that we might be able to help you with. Participating in sharing exchanges like REN-ISAC is very important, both from the perspective of you get the information of when there's a vulnerability you need to be aware of, but also, you're on the front line. So when you see something going on in your network, to let others know, because basically, one person's attack is going to be the next person's defense. And as well, it's very important for the CIO, the CISO, even the provosts and COOs and CEOs of the presidents of the university, need to know why it's important to have these controls in place, and likewise, it's important for the people to understand when there is some sort of control in place, why it's not the CISO just being a jerk. Why those controls are important, and when people understand why there are controls in place, they tend to comply a lot better. So with that, I'd like to hand over the reins to Rodney, where he can continue and talk about some of those angles.
Thanks a lot, Eric, and thank you for the introductions, both by Ken and Eric, to the webinar content so far. I guess I'm the first to welcome you to the October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which I think was intentionally why ACUDA has designated this webinar for the month of October, and I hope many of you do have awareness programs going on at your institution to raise awareness among students, faculty, and staff. I do know that there are many efforts nationally, not only in Washington, D.C., but across the country, largely being coordinated by the National Cybersecurity Alliance, which is the StaySafeOnline.org organization that runs the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month program. What I wanted to reference is back to when Eric was talking about the Presidential Decision Directive and whether or not higher education is critical infrastructure. My work in this area has been going on for about 13 years, and at about that time, right after the PDD 63 that was referred to, we had our first national strategy to secure cyberspace, where it was pretty well recognized that higher education, colleges and universities and research organizations were a critical part of the ecosystem. But as you can expect, when you take a topic like cybersecurity, we are looked at for at least one of three major contributions to cybersecurity. One, which is becoming increasingly important, is the education and training of the future workforce, not only for shortage in government, but in private sector and even in our own sector. Colleges and universities find a shortage of staffing of personnel to address our cybersecurity challenges. Secondly is that we are also research organizations that can discover and develop the next generation of solutions. But again, for purpose of today's webinar and most of what I'm about to talk about, we are owners and operators of some pretty powerful computer systems and networks that not only can interfere with our own business practices, but as you've heard Eric refer to, can be used to launch attacks or to affect other networks as well. So it's that owner-operator perspective that I mostly want to talk with you about for the remainder of my time. So over the past few years, we have had a number of improvements that I'm proud to see. And as I said, for maybe the past 13 or more years since higher education has really been working together as a sector, we've seen a significant increase in investment. And not only the kind of monetary resources that we see in CIO's budgets, but also the kinds of growth in professionals like chief information security officers and others who are devoted to this topic. Yet at the same time, we know that the threats and vulnerabilities have grown, and it's been a very difficult battle to keep up with the bad guys. Whether it's good news or bad news, our reliance and dependence on information technology has also intensified at the same time. So it's become even more important to the C-suites and the boards and, quite frankly, our business of educating and researching for future generations. And then at the same time, our IT environments are increasingly complex. Kind of some of the latest challenges are related to bring your own device or cloud computing and wireless and the like. And then we have regulatory burdens and contractual obligations that are on the increase that make it more and more onerous for campuses to try to keep an information security program not only in compliance, but trying to be the best possible program that it can be. And add to all of that kind of the recent pressures to address college affordability and particularly for public institutions, declines that we are seeing with state funding. So I want to give you a couple frameworks as we talk about what the future might look like for cybersecurity in higher education. The diagram you see on your screen is from an article written by Brad Wheeler from Indiana and James Hilton, who was at University of Virginia at the time, now at the University of Maryland, where they talked about the architecture of community, and in particularly referencing the higher education community as one that we know is quite not only open, as Eric referred to earlier, but collaborative and cooperative. And when you think about the variety of things we do in IT, you know, ultimately our goal as a community is typically to try to increase or maximize our authority as well as our influence. But in reality, we often are finding ourselves in this lower left-hand quadrant where we're quite dependent on commercial providers or third parties, and we're engaging in solo contracts. And in that case, we are finding fairly low authority as well as fairly low influence. But if we want to increase our influence, one of the things that we could do is work together and build some interdependence to develop buying clubs or do demand aggregation. And we've seen that happen within states, within university systems, even within consortiums who band together to leverage buying of software or to work together on common problems. Internet 2Net Plus is not exactly a buying club. It's certainly more than that, but it's another example of how the community has come together to try to cooperate and to work together interdependently. If you move over to the far right-hand corner, however, you see as a way for us to increase our authority is by leveraging our community and working cooperatively there together. And so you see the example of open source software, which we've certainly done in a variety of areas, including information security. When we first sought to protect PII, a few institutions developed their own solutions that other institutions improved upon, and we had a free and open source solution to that topic. And again, though, you can see that our influence is somewhat minimal because we're still dependent on the open source developers. And then finally, in the far right-hand corner is what a true collaborative community might look like, where you both have interdependence and also the maximum amount of influence and authority. And I think it's in that spirit that we're looking for ways that higher education can collaborate and work together and try to leverage our collective resources. We've also talked a lot about the NIST framework, and I just want to briefly kind of draw attention to it in a little more detail, because I suspect many campuses are already working towards some kind of standards-based approach to information security. And things you see on the right side of the screen, much like Eric said, would look like what you would see from the PCI DSS standard or from ISO 27002 or from many of the other standards that are out there. But the more simplified stages on the left to identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover are the phases that the new framework anticipates organizations should try to work through more systematically. And I think it's a helpful framework for us to consider as well. So what are my observations? Again, looking at over the past decade and a half, what's improved and where our challenges are and perhaps where there are gaps and opportunities. Even though we've increased our investment in cybersecurity, there are still significant resource constraints. And the resource constraints not only come from the decline in funding from external sources, in this case state institutions, we also have the kind of the competition for funds, if you will, across the campus and even within the IT organization. I think executive attention kind of comes and goes on this topic. Many of you know that when there's a major breach or a security issue that you suddenly get the president and the cabinet's attention. And as I've heard some CIOs refer to, you probably have 3 to 6 months to take action, and 6 months down the road they will quickly develop amnesia and forget about the incident and move on to the latest crisis. We also know that it's not just about technology and software vulnerability, but quite often our problems are directly the cause of end users being negligent or not acting with the best of caution with respect to not only sharing their own personal information, but their cyber hygiene, if you will. But we do certainly have our share of technical vulnerabilities, and we've worked hard in higher education to try to put pressure on our supply chain to make sure they increase their security of their products and services. And I might add that's an area where the academic side of colleges and universities have been critically important as we try to train and educate the next generation of software developers on more secure coding. And then I think all of us are well aware of the problems associated with our over-reliance on passwords, not only the use of username and passwords for access to single applications, but hundreds of applications, and we know that most users probably use that same username and password over and over again. And then I think Eric made several good references to the culture and the values of higher education that value openness and sharing and collaboration, which are all good academic values, but present problems and issues in the context of security. And so the changes have forced not only the national scene or the federal government, but also state governments to move towards more compliance measures that not only look at security, but increasingly look at privacy. I mentioned earlier that it's not just about compliance with law, but compliance with contractual obligations. And PCI DSS is a good example of that, where it's not a federal law or a state law, but it's a contractual arrangement between the credit card companies and merchants and others that have put this in place. And I think we're increasingly seeing this in the research funding area as well, where contract and grant funding is being contingent on security practices. And we all know that the keeping up with the problems and protecting endpoints increasingly gets more challenging. And as we move to outsource more, do more cloud computing, have hosted environments for our information, the relationship turns from just managing what you do on campus to how you're working with third parties and vendors. And so the matrix earlier referred to how demand aggregation or buying clubs can help leverage the collective, both purchasing power and influence of higher education, and I think we've seen some successes there. But what I hear quite often from those doing security detection as well as response is that there is not enough, there's no shortage of information. In fact, there's almost too much information, and it's really the need for more automated tools and interventions. And so finally, our sector has evolved where I would maintain we're not only specifically not mentioned as one of the critical infrastructures, because we're a little bit of all of the critical infrastructures, in that a typical college or university is kind of like a small city where we have our own transportation systems. Quite often we have our own energy plants, we have our own public safety operation, and certainly our own IT infrastructure and the like. So I think our sector, like some of the other sectors, continues to evolve. So in terms of where there might be opportunities for collaboration, where most of us are pursuing things independently or on our own, and we could leverage working at a system level, a state level, a national level, here are some examples in what I would call the people-touching areas that could be done better, such as collaborating more on awareness content and training so that not every single campus is developing its own. And I think we've seen some good examples in the past of where campuses and other organizations have done that. Executive awareness engagement is being done at an individual campus level, but there is certainly the need to do that at a national level with some of the associations that bring together presidents and CFOs and other. Technical training and certifications is provided by a lot of parties out there, but there is really nobody to kind of broker and facilitate that to make it easy to find and access. And then certainly clearances when needed for security purposes of campus personnel is a very difficult and troublesome process, and so some need for coordination there would be helpful. And then the notion of managed security service is certainly something that commercial companies do provide, but the notion that smaller, mid-sized institutions still don't have a CISO and maybe will not be able to afford a CISO anytime soon calls for some demand for some sharing of resources or perhaps a CISO on a loan basis. And then finally, in the people area, I know because of the demand for cybersecurity workers, a lot of CISOs and security directors spend an inordinate amount of their time conducting searches, writing job descriptions when they would probably rather be turning their attention to the security processes at hand. So looking at some process examples where collaboration could happen even more than it currently is peer reviews and doing information security program reviews across institutions. There's certainly no shortage of standards available, but modifying those standards, adopting them specifically to meet research and education organizations' needs. The need for coordination across the sector is something that the REN-ISAC is increasingly trying to help act as a CSIRT on behalf of the research and education sector. Incident handling and response is something that is, back to the NIST framework, one of those more reactive modes that you get into after an incident happens, and you don't often have the spare cycles for somebody just sitting around waiting to do incident handling, so there may be some resource sharing there as well. And then compliance programs obviously are not unique. They may be unique state by state because of state laws, but nationally they're certainly not unique, and so working together more on some standards and frameworks for compliance. And we've referred to demand aggregation specifically, but even the process of doing site licensing across a single enterprise as well as multiple enterprises. The Department of Homeland Security and others do a lot of funding of applied technology challenges in cybersecurity, and yet they find many of those results and developments are never deployed because of the lack of the ability to transition them into practice. And so there's been the need and the mention of some kind of incubator for new products and services to get them more quickly transitioned into, in our case, colleges and universities. And then finally, and perhaps one of the most significant challenges as we move to more reliance on third parties, is the ability to validate, audit, conduct risk assessments of the third parties that are providing services. And then finally, moving to the technology area, forensics analysis is something that is only needed, again, quite often in that recovery phase or after an incident happens. A few institutions have some robust capability there, but it's quite often sitting idle, and there's opportunities to either leverage that or certainly there's commercial options there. And you can see down through the list a number of things: malware analysis, network monitoring, scans, penetration testing, scanning of web applications, rather than just turning to the commercial providers of these services that kind of put us into that lower left-hand quadrant. If there are ways for us to work together more collaboratively, I think it will help improve both efficiency and effectiveness. So in conclusion, as we think about the collective needs of higher education, what we are trying to move towards is more unification of approach and representation for higher education, which leads me really to the second point about the need for brokers and facilitators of engagement between higher education as a sector and the other sectors, the commercial, the government, the nonprofit sectors. It's very difficult, very inefficient for 4,000 plus universities to be doing this all on their own. And that finally, the previous three slides that talked about people and process and technology solutions suggest there are ways that higher education could move more towards a shared services model that leverages our interdependence and our common interests and really builds on our strengths as collaborative and cooperative communities. So again, I would just like to say happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we are going to now turn to some questions and discussion. I know most of your focus is on the federal level and what's happening in Washington. Do you or your practice have any sense of what's happening at the state level or how the state and federal level are interacting around the topic of cybersecurity?
Well, I think the maybe the main venue for action, or at least the one I'm most familiar with, is in California. They've recently amended their data breach and notification law, and for higher education, it seemed to me for years that you'd want a federal standard, just like businesses want a unified federal standard for breach and notification. For higher education, if an institution in Connecticut has students online in 14, 15, 20, 40 different states, and their system is hacked, they've got to know and comply with the notification and data breach requirements of each state's law for the residents in their state. To me, that's a huge burden, and one that federal law could ease, not just for higher education, but for commercial entities as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's, for better or for worse, this is a new area in technology, and it's a new area in law and policy. And no, I can imagine, because we at Georgetown, we have one degree program that's offered in 46 states. And, it was one thing, our Office of General Counsel, they know how to get, graduate degrees approved in the different states. They had no idea that, sort of the business of the university. So, obviously we get paid for this particular master's program, which means we're collecting payment information and all that. And, it was sort of a shock for them to realize, oh yeah, I've got to be aware of, all the different data breach notification laws, all of the different privacy laws, and sort of the business of running the university.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, I think, or liability overhang for colleges and universities, and I'm not sure how well it's been recognized.
Do you advise collaboration with InfraGard?
Yeah, this is Rodney. Let me just say that InfraGard has been around for a long time, and I actually was a member of our chapter in Maryland. And the feedback I've received over the past several years is that InfraGard on the whole is a very effective and worthwhile organization. I also hear that it's highly dependent on the area of the country you live in, because InfraGard is organized according to the FBI field offices. So, for example, the organization I was involved in was in Maryland, which was kind of the Baltimore, D.C. chapter, which I obviously was highly effective because we could draw on the national FBI office for speakers and for experts, and it was very active both in terms of meetings as well as content, whereas I've heard from some more rural and less active areas it's not been as helpful. So I think it is helpful. I think the other complaint I've heard is because its concerns are all hazards, not just cybersecurity, that, again, depending on the field office, they may focus more on other types of security and less on cybersecurity. So, the good news is typically you know in advance what the programs are going to be about, and you can pick and choose. But I think on the whole it is an effective program.
Yeah, and this is Eric. I also know the Boston area office also had a very effective cyber focus, as you can imagine, being around the 495 corridor up there, and one of the important things there is, going now to the sort of the cybersecurity research, the most effective deterrent and way to make cyber crime stop actually is the old-fashioned kind. It's interdiction, arrest, and prosecution. And that's something to keep in mind, because if you've been under attack, if you've experienced an attack, you've put out the fire, the last thing you want to think of is, chain of custody of forensic evidence and all that. But that's one of the most important things to have around for a long-term solution. And that's where working with like an InfraGard or being involved with a REN-ISAC, because REN-ISAC has both direct connections to DHS, but also indirect connections to the FBI and your local state law enforcement. It's not so much that, hey, there's this formal program, but you are a lot more comfortable bringing that information to the local person that you know, as opposed to oh, you mean if I call the police or I call the FBI, it means I've got just so much more work to deal with. And that's why, again, it's important to be involved if you can.
Okay, we have one more question. The first part of the presentation focused on federal legislative effort, or lack thereof. I'm curious on your thoughts on what may be practical and positive changes to the legislative framework. Are there specific things you would like to see created in law?
Well, this is Ken. I guess what I'd like to see just is action. And I think there are a lot of smart people on Capitol Hill and a lot of very smart staffers that advise them. And, you know, if the process worked as it used to work before all the polarization, you know, Congress would have been able to come up with a reasoned, sensible approach that likely would have helped industry, in this case to higher education, to address these new challenges that are just growing exponentially. The one thing that I'd like to see done, and this may be off the reservation, last month I think it was, or maybe it was early this month, 60 Minutes had a segment on fraudulent income tax refunds. There's a whole national, international business of scamming the IRS out of fake refunds for pretending to be electronic filers. And they focused on this one young guy who worked for a tax preparation company, and he said that he did, I don't remember the number, but it was hundreds and hundreds of these fraudulent refund claims. And he was sentenced to 14 months in prison. It seems to me that the government should make engaging in this kind of cybersecurity breach activity a very painful thing to be caught engaging in. And 14 months in prison, even in a federal prison, is not going to do it. I think you've got to really step up the penalty side. Now, that has nothing to do with substance, and I leave it to Rodney and Eric to offer their observation.
Well, I would observe that before President Obama came in the office, there was a commission that put forward some recommendations on cybersecurity for the 44th presidency, and I had an opportunity to testify at one of their hearings. And, you know, a couple of my main points from a higher education perspective is not necessarily more regulation or legislation, but unification of the existing legislation in higher education sense. You know, we've got, you know, FERPA for student information, we've got HIPAA for health information, we've got Graham-Leach-Bliley for financial information, and on through the alphabet soup, if you will. And so it wasn't really the need for more, but for some more kind of streamlining and coherent legislation. I think the second area of concern was the updating of old authorities, particularly some of the cybercrime and computer crime laws, to kind of bring them up to date. And so to fast forward to after the Obama administration took office, he took advantage of some of those recommendations and tasked somebody to write a cyberspace policy review that came up with several recommendations, near-term, mid-term, and long-term. And having been actively involved in several of those initiatives, you know, I'm happy to say that a lot of the non-legislative recommendations have moved forward. You know, for example, a national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace and national infrastructure protection plan update and the like. But the legislative proposals, even though there was a comprehensive package from the White House delivered to Congress and many efforts in Congress, they've not actually moved forward. So that's been quite disappointing, and nonetheless, which is why we've seen the executive orders kind of come into play as a way of maintaining some progress.
And like, you know, a lot of things in government, it's a shade, you know, area of gray. You know, there's some things that actually really only the legislature can do, particularly around information sharing. There's a lot of concern that if you share with, like the top 50 universities, the next 50 universities are saying, well, wait a minute, that's unfair. And so, there's issues of fairness. Likewise, in some of the industrial sectors, there's issues of, well, if you've got a bunch of companies sitting together planning how to make them better off, that sounds an awful lot like collusion and anti-competitive behavior. Here, it's clearly being done for the best of reasons and the noblest of purposes, and so you want to let them do it, but it's a shade of gray, because if you allow the venues to share any kind of information, then they start sharing bidding information and competitive information.
And on that last point, in April of this year, there's a joint policy statement put out by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, saying that if those kinds of meetings are legitimate, quote unquote, they're not going to go after them for antitrust violations. But it's a cumbersome process, because you have to get clearance before you proceed. And earlier this month, Justice said this one activity could proceed, but that's not helpful. I mean, it's helpful, but it's not really helpful. And one of the very senior members, Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Hatch, who is chair of the Republican High-Tech Task Force in the Senate, gave a speech outlining his high-tech agenda for the next Congress. And prominent on that list is enacting cybersecurity legislation to facilitate that kind of information sharing, saying that the path to federal getting a federal law passed is a voluntary, non-regulatory approach. Now that's the Republican position on this, but if they have both in the House and the Senate, and if the White House means what it said earlier this month, that let's do these things in smaller chunks, maybe that's what will happen fairly early next year.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much for your informative presentation today. Please watch for details on upcoming ACUDA webinars. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. This concludes our webinar.